Patrick Jane spent 9 years looking for one person. He built walls covered in photographs. He memorized names. He followed murders across California. He narrowed thousands of suspects down to 7. And eventually, he found Red John. At least, that is what everyone thought. Because there was one detail about Jane's investigation that never made sense. Red John always seemed to know what Jane was doing. He knew when Jane was getting close. He knew which people Jane was investigating. He even knew the names on Jane's final list. And the strange thing is, there was one person who had access to almost everything Jane knew. She worked beside him. She knew his investigation. She knew his methods. She knew his suspects. And Jane trusted her enough to tell her things he wouldn't tell anyone else. Teresa Lisbon. And once you start looking at the series from her side, the entire Red John's story changes. The perfect position. The first thing we need to understand is what made Red John so difficult to catch. It wasn't that he was invisible, it was that Jane was always investigating after Red John had already made his move. Jane would find a murder, then a clue, then a connection, then another victim, and every time Jane thought he was finally getting closer, Red John was already somewhere else. That sounds like an impossible level of intelligence, until you look at who was standing beside Jane. Lisbon wasn't an outsider. She wasn't someone Red John had to infiltrate. She was Jane's partner. She was inside the CBI. She had access to the same cases. She knew which direction Jane was moving in, and more importantly, Jane trusted her. That distinction matters. A spy has to convince someone to trust them. Lisbon didn't. So Red John didn't need to find a way into Jane's investigation. She was the investigation. Then, the one person who knew the least. This becomes much harder to ignore in season 5. Jane finally narrows Red John down. Not to hundreds, not to 30, not even 10. 7. Bert Stiles, Gail Bertram, Ray Hafner, Reed Smith, Robert Kirkland, Thomas McAllister, Barrett Partridge, and there is something very important about this list. Lisbon knows it. She is the only person beside Jane who knows the 7 names. Now look at this from Lisbon's perspective. Jane has spent years trying to discover Red John's identity, and suddenly he gives her the answer he's been searching for. 7 names, 7 possibilities. One of them is Red John. But Lisbon doesn't have to search through 7 people. She doesn't have to wonder. She already knows. And that creates a completely different situation. Because Jane thinks he's finally reduced Red John's word to 7 people. But Red John has just learned something even more valuable. Exactly what Jane knows about him. And Lisbon does something very interesting. After learning the 7 names, Lisbon doesn't simply sit on the information. She wants the team to investigate them. Even though Patrick tells him not to do that, she secretly asks Van Pelt to track their phones so they can monitor their activities. On the surface, this is exactly what you expect from Lisbon. She's trying to catch Red John. But there is another consequence. Now Lisbon has an excuse to monitor all 7 suspects. She knows where they are going. She knows what they are doing. She knows which ones Jane is watching. And she can influence how the investigation moves. That is the important part. Red John doesn't need to eliminate every suspect himself. He only needs to make sure Jane keeps looking at the wrong ones. And Lisbon is in a position where she can see the entire board. But Red John's biggest advantage. There's another problem for Jane. He is brilliant at reading people, but Jane has always had one weakness. He trusts the people he considers his own. Look at his relationship with Lisbon. She can interrupt his plans. She can tell him he's being reckless. She can walk into him. She can challenge him. And Jane doesn't immediately suspect her. Why? Lisbon isn't a suspect. She's Lisbon. That's a completely different category in his mind. And that is exactly what makes her position so powerful. A stranger trying to manipulate Patrick Jane has a problem. Jane watches strangers. He studies them. He looks for inconsistencies. But Lisbon doesn't have to convince Jane that she's trustworthy. She already passed that test years ago. Then we get to this part, the strangest Red John move. Now go back to season 4. Jane has become obsessed with Red John again. He deliberately destroys his own reputation. He pretends to have lost control. He gets closer to Lorelai. And eventually, Red John makes Jane an offer, a new life, friendship, a chance to stop hunting him. But Red John wants proof that Jane has truly changed. The gift? Lisbon's dead body. Jane refuses. Instead, he and the team fake Lisbon's death and use the deception to try to lure Red John out. Normally, this scene tells us something about Red John. He knows Lisbon is important to Jane, but there is another detail hiding underneath it. Red John chose Lisbon, not Joe, not Van Pelt, not Rigsby. Lisbon. The person closest to Jane, the person Jane trusts, the person who has been beside him for years. And if Red John is Lisbon, request becomes almost absurdly personal, because she's essentially telling Jane, kill the person you trust the most, while knowing that the person is herself. But the game gets more personal. And that changed the meaning of everything. Red John wasn't simply trying to frighten Jane. He was testing him. How much does Jane care about Lisbon? How far would Jane go to save her? Would Jane choose revenge or Lisbon? And Jane chooses Lisbon. He creates an elaborate plan to save her. He lies. He manipulates the CBI. He fakes deaths. He risks everything. And Lisbon survives. But from Red John's perspective, that is useful information. Now she knows exactly how much power she has over Jane, because Jane has just demonstrated something Red John desperately needed to know. Lisbon is more important to him than reaching to Red John. But then Red John starts losing people. The 7 suspects begin disappearing. Partridge dies. Kirkland dies. The list gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Jane thinks he's eliminating Red John's possibilities. But there is another way to look at it. Every time one suspect disappears, Lisbon's position becomes safer. Because Lisbon was never on the list. She doesn't need to survive the investigation. She only needs to survive the people on the list. And Jane is doing the work for her. He is hunting 7 men, while the real Red John watches the list shrink. Then, the man Jane finally kills. Eventually, Jane gets down to Thomas McAllister. McAllister is revealed as Red John. Jane chases him. McAllister tries to escape. Jane catches him, and Jane kills him. For the first time in 9 years, Patrick Jane believes the game is over. But look at what this victory actually gives Lisbon. The investigation ends. The FBI stops looking for Red John. Jane, the smartest man in the world, stops searching. The suspect is dead. The case is closed, and the person who was never on the list is still standing beside Jane. That is the perfect ending that happened for the Red John, because the greatest way to survive an investigation isn't to defeat the investigator, it is to make him believe he has already won. But there's something even better. Jane doesn't just stop looking, he starts building a new life. And who is there? Lisbon. The person who stayed beside him through the entire investigation, the person he trusted, the person who knew what he had been through, the person he eventually fell in love with. And this is where Red John's plan becomes almost ridiculous in its perfection. Because Jane spent 9 years to find the person who destroyed his family, and eventually he gives his heart to the person who was secretly responsible. And the final result, at the end of the series, Jane and Lisbon get married. Jane finally has the life he thought he had lost forever. No more Red John, no more hunting, no more revenge, just Lisbon. A family, a future, peace. And that is exactly why the ending is so disturbing, because Lisbon is Red John. Jane's happy ending isn't a happy ending at all. It is Red John's masterpiece. Think about what she accomplished. She didn't kill Jane. She didn't destroy his career. She didn't make Jane go insane. She did something much more difficult. She made Jane trust her for years, and then he made Jane love her. The biggest manipulation. People always think Red John's greatest achievement was killing Jane's wife and daughter. It wasn't. That was the beginning. The real victory was what happened afterward. Jane dedicated his entire life to finding Red John. Every investigation, every suspect, every clue, every sacrifice, everything led back to one question. Who is Red John? And the answer was standing beside him, listening to him, working with him, helping him, arguing with him, saving him, loving him. And Jane never saw it because Red John's greatest disguise wasn't a mask, it was trust. Go back to the beginning, now rewatch the early seasons. Don't watch Lisbon as Jane's boss. Don't watch her as his colleague. Watch her as the person who had the most valuable position in the entire series. She knew Jane's habit. She knew when he was lying. She knew when he was planning something. She knew when he was getting close to Red John. And she knew what Red John meant to him. Then remember something else. Lisbon wasn't always obsessed with catching Red John. Early in the series, she repeatedly tried to keep Jane from destroying himself over the case. At first, that looks like concern. But look at the result. Jane doesn't stop. He keeps hunting, he keeps searching, he keeps playing the game, and Lisbon remains beside him. Because perhaps Red John's greatest weapon wasn't making Jane stop. It was making sure Jane never stopped looking in the right direction. The perfect alibi. And this is what makes Lisbon so difficult to suspect. She's not hiding from Jane. She's doing the opposite. She's helping him. It is the perfect alibi. Every time Jane gets closer to Red John, Lisbon is there helping him. Every time Jane gets hurt, Lisbon is there. Every time Jane needs someone, Lisbon is there. And that creates the ultimate psychological blind spot. Jane doesn't think, could Lisbon be Red John? He thinks Lisbon is helping me find Red John. Those two thoughts cannot exist comfortably in his mind at the same time. And Lisbon never gives him a reason to choose the second one. And then she gets the one thing Red John never had, Jane's trust. Red John has Jane's fear, he had Jane's obsession, he had Jane's hatred, but Lisbon gets something far more valuable, Jane's love. And that is the difference. Red John spent years trying to control Patrick Jane from the outside. Lisbon didn't need to. She got inside his life, and eventually, Jane chose her voluntarily. But the marriage. So go back to the final scene. Look at Jane, look at Lisbon, look at how relieved he is. After everything he's been through, he finally believes he's safe. And Lisbon knows something he doesn't. The man standing beside her spent 9 years hunting her, and he never found her. Not because she was too clever to leave clues, not because she disappeared, not because she ran, because she stayed right beside him. And that is the part that makes the entire story collapse into perfect joke. Patrick Jane dedicated his life to finding Red John, and in the end, he married her. The real victory. That is why the McAllister's death isn't the end of Red John's story. It is only the final misdirection. Jane kills the man everyone believes is Red John. Jane closes the case, and Lisbon gets what she wanted. Not freedom, something much better. A life where nobody is looking for Red John, because Patrick Jane himself has decided that Red John is dead. And who could possibly convince him otherwise? In the end, Patrick Jane was supposed to be the one person Red John could never fool. He was the mentalist, the man who could read anyone, the man who could see through lies, the man who could manipulate an entire room without anyone noticing. And Red John knew that. So she didn't try to beat Jane at his own game. She changed the entire game. She became the one person Jane could never put under investigation. The one person Jane could never treat like a suspect. The one person Jane would never seriously consider betraying him. Teresa Lisbon. And that is why the final scene of The Mentalist isn't really a wedding. It is a perfect victory ceremony. Patrick Jane thinks he's finally escaped Red John. But Red John has already won. She has his trust, his love, his future, his family, and most importantly, his certainty that the nightmare is over. 9 years of hunting, thousands of clues, 7 final suspects, and one dead Red John. And the entire time, the answer was standing right next to him. The biggest plot twist in The Mentalist was never finding Red John. It was actually never realizing who he was. And the endgame, Red John won.